Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading all different kinds of true, scary stories. Everything from backwoods to creepy encounters, even paranormal. If it's a scary story, it will be in this video. Also, our guest for today's video really needs no introduction. I'm sure many of you already know of this creator. Today, we are going to be joined by Swamp Dweller. If you somehow have not heard of him yet, the link for his channel will be in the description down below. I want to thank him for joining us on this video. I'm very excited to have him on. But now, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories.
Footprints in the Ice by Boobius Hackred. I'll keep this short and sweet. A few years back, we were having a brutally cold winter. The snow had frozen into ice and covered everything. It was pitch black in the backyard when I let my dog outside one last time before bed that evening. As we exited the house from the sliding door of the walkout basement and onto the lower deck, I felt like something was off. Our home backs up to some woods, so I was accustomed to hearing noises from the wildlife at night. But this was different. Nothing made a sound except the cold Arctic wind, but I felt I was being watched. When my dog was in the backyard, I looked around nervously, expecting a coyote or a predator to pop out of the tree line. My dog did his business, but afterwards stopped and stared at a corner of the woods until I got creeped out and called him back inside. I quickly locked the sliding door and shut the curtains, unable to shake the uneasy feeling I had outside. Then, after double and triple checking all the locks in the house, I finally felt at ease enough to go to bed. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I hear the muffled sound of my dog barking from the basement 2 floors below. I got up, stumbled down 3 flights of stairs, and found him standing at the basement sliding door. He was peeking his head through the closed curtains, barking his head off with the hairs standing up all on his back. I tried calling him away from the door, but he would not let up. I dreaded peeking out the curtain to see what he was barking at, after the uneasy feeling I had from earlier in the night. Finally, I held my breath, swiped the curtain aside. I peered into the blacky inkness, but I saw nothing to cause any alarm. A wave of relief washed over me. I figured it must have been a deer or a raccoon in the yard that set him off. He whined at the door for a few more minutes until I bribed him upstairs with a dog cookie. After that, I went back to bed and wasn't disturbed again that night. That is until the morning when I went to the basement to let out the dog. I opened the sliding door and walked out onto the deck as he bounded into the snow. When I looked down, my blood ran as cold as the sub-zero morning temperatures. A set of bare human footprints were frozen in the ice on the deck. They were obvious. I could make out each toe of the person's foot. The prints were large and appeared to be in the form of an adult, maybe a male. Looking around, I noticed they started at the base of the deck and disappeared off the side of the deck. I had my snow boots on, so I walked around the yard, but I could find no trace of the footprints in the snow once they left the deck. Keep in mind, the daily temperatures were at around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill was close to 20 below. Frostbite would set in within a matter of minutes for anyone walking around barefoot, especially in the dead of night. I never experienced anything like that again, but I have adopted a second dog.
December 2022, I was home on leave. I'm a United States Marine headed home to Kentucky. I'm 20 years old. I haven't seen my boys from home for 6 to 7 months, so we arranged to hang out. I dropped one of my friends off and drove another 30 to 45 minutes to drop my other friend off. I dropped him off last because he lived slightly closer to me than friend 1, and I was running low on gas. Plus, it was 1 in the morning. I'll call friend 1 Nate and friend 2 Gage. Gage lives in the middle of nowhere, an hour from my house in the backwoods, with nothing but trees as far as the eye can see, with an occasional abandoned church here and there. I had dropped Gage off and started my trip back home, and had only just noticed how low on gas I am. I was driving a V6 Suzuki. I knew older cars tend to have more gas than they show, so I thought I could make it home. Plus, with all the hills, I could just ride it out. Got maybe 25 minutes out from my friend's house before the car stopped moving after I hit a steep hill. I went to call my dad to come help me, but of course my phone was dead. That's the moment my heart sank to my stomach. I turned the car's heat on low and turned everything but the heater off to preserve battery. I waited in the car for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes before the heat stopped working. I threw on all my warming layers and my combat boots, hopped out of the car, and got smacked in the face with what felt like negative 20-degree wind. Where I live, there's no bears, but wolves are very prominent, and I didn't have any weapons with me. But with that, I began my walk to my boy's house, made it about 30 feet from my car when I heard a wolf's howl and snow crunching under something's feet/paws. After hearing that, I stopped in my tracks and began to walk backwards, looking behind me every 2 to 3 steps, when I see 2 glowing eyes peer over the top of the hill, staring right at me. I continued walking slowly back to my car, keeping my eyes on the pair of eyes in the distance that seemed to also be getting closer. The crunching of snow got louder, faster, and seemed to triple in sound. I sprinted the rest of the 15 to 20 feet that I had left. I locked myself in the car. I was freezing in the car at this point. I had accepted I'd either freeze to death or die by wild animals. Finally, 2 headlights appear in my rearview mirror, and I've never been happier in my life. I waited for the car to get close enough before determining the wolves were gone, hopped out and flagged the car down. She stopped, let me use her phone to call my dad, and we've been dating for 3 weeks now. Bucket list trip. Before the term bucket list got coined, a trip to London was on my list of things to do before I die. The desire to visit London started with the Beatles. I had an affinity for the British accent, the British 1960s music, and how the British were portrayed in movies. Classy and proper. But not all British people are classy and proper. I didn't want to join a travel tour group. I wanted to fly solo and follow my own itinerary. I bought the book London for Dummies to plan my trip. My trip was booked for May 1st, a day that commemorated my father's passing into the beyond. I wanted to remember this day as my first flight into the blue beyond. I boarded at ABIA, then connected at Bush Intercontinental, with an arrival time of 7:20 a.m. at Gatwick, London on May 2nd, 2002. After clearing customs, I took the trip into London. Arrival point, Victoria train station. From there, I rode the tube to the hotel. I could have walked, but nevertheless, I experienced the tube as morning rush hour. During my stay, I visited the Little Tate Museum, walked to St. James Park, Buckingham Palace, ate fish and chips, and drank a Mr. Pimm's at a pub. I mostly stuck to the tourist areas as advised by a friend who had visited London before. I also boarded a city tour bus that drove by such attractions like the Globe Theatre, the London Eye, the campy London Dungeon, Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, and other attractions. One could hop off the bus, visit desired attraction, then hop back on the next bus by presenting a purchased ticket. One of the bus drivers took an interest in me. He asked me where I was from and if I was traveling alone. I was flattered by his interest because he was handsome, so I answered that I was traveling alone and was from the US. I asked him if the bus had a route by the British Museum. "Sadly, no," he answered. And surprisingly, he offered to take me to the British Museum after his shift. I agreed and take him up on his offer. The plan was that the bus would be taken to the depot and the trip would continue in the bus driver's car. After the other passengers exited, I was allowed to remain on the bus. As the off-duty bus drove further away from the tourist area, I began regretting my ridiculous decision. I don't really know this man, this bus driver named Oscar. To further my regret, Oscar wanted to stop by his apartment to freshen up. Oscar answered a phone call that made him really angry. He didn't sound very classy and proper anymore. I started to visualize headlines like, "Tourist gets assaulted," "Tourist goes missing." I was mentally screaming, "Get out now." In a firm but calm voice, I told the bus driver to let me out now, as we were at a pause by a traffic light. Oscar looked surprised, but he said, "Okay, just step away from the door, because when it opens it'll hit you." I was too close to the door, so I moved a little bit and the door did hit me, but I was glad that I was off that bus. I tried hailing a cab, and someone noticed my futility and instructed me to order a cab from the nearby hospital on Charing Cross Road. The upside of the misadventure was that I rode in a vintage taxi cab, and I didn't make the headlines. During the rest of my stay, I didn't run into Oscar, the tour bus driver, again. When I was 14, my mother's great-grandmother died, and I heard a cry. I was dead asleep, but my mother got a call in the middle of the night. Her mournful scream radiated from all corners of the house. Her grandmother loved her more than anyone in her childhood. She had a bone disease. Her mother already had 4 other kids, so she was stunted or ignored in a way as much as possible. During the summers when my mom wasn't in the hospital, her grandmother and husband, not biological, took her in. They treated her like an angel, even though she was visibly deformed in the legs. She always said she spent her best times there, minus wrestling with her brothers. On one long scream as a 14-year-old, I knew someone had died. Dad told us it was Myrtle, great-grandmother. We knew Mom needed to go with Dad to not worry about the kids. We loved her too. She always treated us like gems as well. The next night, about 24 hours after her passing, I was lying in bed. I was nowhere near asleep. I take a lot of time. I looked over to the other side of the room. I saw an exact cutout of her form filled with static, like if a TV wasn't reading a channel properly. I knew it was her instantly checking up on us. Everyone else, my siblings, were asleep. I just looked at the figure and told her that we would all be all right and she could go in peace. I rolled over in bed after that to go to sleep. No fear, no hesitation. I actually felt peace as well. She had Alzheimer's, so to feel her, I can't describe. I didn't tell my mom till years later. I felt like she needed time to deal with all of her memories first. When I told her, she just nodded. She is very Irish, so the afterlife isn't crazy to her. In the end, I think it gave her comfort to know that she was still there for us. My mom now has CHF, so I know at least she has someone watching her back or ready to receive her with open arms. Time is a perspective. We're all just human. All we can all ask for is to go home in the end. The summer of 2008 was a rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree, only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping. But that summer, it became an escape to the point of an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health. while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June, and unseasonably cold, wet, and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funnily enough, was to hike from Storm Lake over Storm Lake Pass and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to and requires a 4x4 pickup truck and some skilled driving. The road is a narrow 2-track, winding its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine. There are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up into the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or further away, and the sound wasn't above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane, or a truck, or a bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes, the rumbling faded away, and I was left again with only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough, I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest, I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. They taste like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake, building up my fire for the night. I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early, and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. The sounds of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort and starting to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire's crackling, I could pick up that all too familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was growing louder than before, and closer. I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. The noise was ruining my camping trip and my buzz. Frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut the F up, a-hole." Like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I realized that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams. And I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sat there, listening to the fire cracking, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment, I had felt alone but safe. Now I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt there were a million eyes in the dark watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pulling and moving under my tent. The storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was ever more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town, but I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy 2-track road, would have been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain and kept the campsite well lit. I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of a hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today. That was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. before I finished picking up camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy bobsled track of a road, not once looking in the rearview mirror. I have never been back to Storm Lake, and I probably never will. For the first 13 years of her life, Genie Wiley was cut off from society and any socialization. Wiley was so neglected by her incapable mother and severely violent father that she never learned to talk and had stunted growth that made her appear to be no older than 8 years old. When she was born, Clark Wiley came to the conclusion that his daughter would be useless to society because he decided she was mentally disabled. He thereby exiled her from society. No one was allowed to speak to the girl, who was mostly sequestered in a pitch-black room or a temporary cage. She wasn't potty trained, and he kept her chained to a toddler toilet like a straitjacket. For any infraction, Clark Wiley would strike her with a big piece of wood. He would growl at the door like a crazy guard dog, giving the girl a lifelong aversion to creatures with claws. Due to Wiley's later inappropriate behavior, especially when she engaged older males, some experts speculate that SA also took place. Mother of Genie Wiley claimed later that her near blindness prevented her from pleading for her daughter. But eventually, 14 years after Genie Wiley first encountered her harsh father, her mother mustered the resolve to leave. She accidentally entered social services in 1970, thinking it was a location where they provided assistance to the blind. The small child was acting very strangely, hopping like a rabbit instead of walking, which instantly alerted the office colleagues. Genie Wiley was then almost 14 years old, yet she appeared to be only 8. Both parents were promptly charged with child abuse, but Clark Wiley would unalive himself just before the trial. The world will never understand. Read the note he left behind. Wiley was adopted by the state as a ward. She was only able to speak a few phrases when she arrived to UCLA Children's Hospital, where staff members described her as the most deeply wounded child they had ever seen. She was studied and exploited for years. Eventually, her mother regained custody and refused to let her be the subject of any more experiments. The video game Mario Sunshine has always instilled a sense of anxiety in me. It brings back to me memories of a troubled time where I was very anxious in my most innocent years of my life. When I was 5 years old, my family took a vacation to a sun-soaked island in the Mediterranean. I won't say which one, but it's a popular destination for many. My memories of the vacation are happy for the most part, except for this one next part. I remember going to dinner with my parents. My dad excused himself to go to the bathroom, and I remember a woman I did not know approaching my mom, kindly greeting her before leaning in and whispering something to my mom. The woman kept her eyes on me and smiled when she whispered something to my mom. I remember my mom having a look of concern on her face, and the woman quickly walked away. I remember my mom talking to my dad in a hushed tone when he returned, both of them looking at me. I don't remember if I asked them questions or not, but I do remember that for the rest of the vacation, I was kept close to my parents, and my parents were constantly looking over their shoulder the rest of the trip, as well as after the trip. As I got older, I pushed these memories from my mind until one time in my teen years. I remembered the trip because I was playing Mario Sunshine at the time and was reminiscing about it with my family. I then asked about the woman who talked to my mom, and my mom was straight up with me. She had told me that the woman had made a comment about how she would love to take me home with her, and that she would do anything to have me. My mom obviously was concerned with this, while my dad wasn't so much. But both my parents told me that they remembered seeing this woman lingering around us a lot the rest of the trip. What they told me next was information I had never known about. They said that the morning we were about to leave to go back home, they had found a note on the hotel room door that morning. They said the note they found had said the exact same thing that she had told my mom, that she wanted their son. They continued keeping me close. My dad swears he saw the woman at the airport, watching them. My mom says it wasn't her. But that is how Mario Sunshine makes me think about how I was targeted for kidnapping when I was young. This happened to me last year. I got a receptionist job at a clinic in my city, but the training was at a branch in another city about 40 minutes away. My boss would call an Uber every day in the morning for me to go, and at night for me to come back. The point of departure and arrival was at the clinic in my city. Sometimes I went alone, and other times other girls from other sectors also went with me to the training. The training lasted a month, and as it was through the Uber app, there were 2 different drivers a day. Most of the drivers were calm, so sometimes I would feel comfortable after finishing the trip at the clinic to ask to pay extra for them to bring me home, since I would arrive late at night. The clinic was not close to my house, and it's dangerous out there in the streets. One night, returning to my city, me, another girl, and the Uber driver talked a lot during the trip. Sometimes he would make a flirty comment to me and the other girl, but as she was laughing and finding it all so funny, I didn't pay too much attention at that moment. When we arrived at the clinic, I asked if I could pay extra for the ride to be to my house as usual, and he agreed. The other girl got out, and he ended the trip, which was recorded. From then on, his entire demeanor changed. I think he felt safe doing this, as he had ended the race on the app, so nothing he said would be recorded. While I dictated the way to my house, he released several comments like, "Do you think you've had enough time to decide if it's safe for me to drive you to your house? You don't know me. I've already finished the trip and nobody knows you're still here. What if I'm a psychopath? I have triple your size. I can pin you down and do whatever I want to you in this car, and you wouldn't even be able to fight back. Can you imagine?" By this time, I was already in panic. I didn't know what to answer, and I could barely tell him the way to my house. After that, he laughed in my face and said, "But I'm not, and you're very, very lucky that I don't know the city, so I don't know any alley that I could walk into. By the way, where can I get a coffee after taking you home? I'm starving." He would blurt out disturbing comments, then laugh and casually change the subject. It was the most tense trip I've ever had, and when he stopped in front of my house, I was so nervous that I couldn't find the money in my bag, and he still said, "If you don't have money, there are other ways to pay that I wouldn't mind." I didn't even wait for my change and got out of the car. And to this day, I panic when I remember, because I know he knows where I live. As soon as I got in the house and was able to think rationally, I realized that I should have asked him to stop the car and run, but I was so terrified by his comments and the tone of his voice that I couldn't even think at the time. background. I'm a guy who needs glasses to see, or else I'm pretty much blind. I also live alone in a rather small apartment on the 3rd floor. This morning I woke up as usual after a good night's sleep. I slowly wake up my eyes, starting to think about getting ready for the workday. As I open them, I see a black figure in the 6-inch crack between my door and the frame. I freeze in terror. There's a person on the other side of the room staring at me as I was sleeping. I start to panic and have 1,000 thoughts coming at me all at the same time. What do I do? I stare at it without losing sight of it, without blinking, and pretending to still be sleeping. After about 10 to 15 minutes of staring, immobile, I realize that I must do something. My only rational plan was to jump out of my bed, which was practically on the ground, and hope to be able to close the door that's 3 meters away without the person being quick enough to react before me. I realize that's not a good idea, as I'm convinced the person has to be armed or have intentions of hurting me. In my mind, the only thing left to do was to phone for help. But how? My phone screen would surely give away that I'm awake, and it's on the other side of the bed, and I was laying on the side and facing away from it. I then very slowly move my right arm over me to the left and try to carefully find it. I get a hold of it. Now, to turn the brightness off without having to look at it. For context, my bed cover is very thick and up to my chin at this point. Oh no, my phone's an Android, and they randomly lock up and need a password to open instead of my thumbprint for security purposes. I then very slowly and carefully enter my password, with it under the covers and barely seeing it. After having the phone in my hands for what seemed to be an eternity, I thought about what to do, as calling the police would inevitably start an irreversible and very serious process. I start to dial their number, very slowly as to not show any signs of being awake. I then quickly receive an answer, but I can't hear much as I don't want to put the phone to my ear, as it would be visible to the stranger. I can't talk either, because the person on the other side of the door would hear it. After the call operator telling me he can't hear me correctly, I'm frozen in panic. I need to speak louder, but I can't. Looking back, I think I must have accidentally hit the end call button with my thumb because the call ended. I then redial and the same thing happens. They can't hear me enough to understand my address. I hang up, hoping that they'd locate the call's location in time. But there's 3 apartments in the building, so they'd need to take time to find the right one, which is at the 3rd floor. After thinking about what to do for what seemed like an eternity, I redial for a 3rd time. This time I hold the phone very close to my mouth, while trying to conceal it under the covers, and speak as softly as I can to give them my 4-digit address and street name. After a lot of back and forth to confirm the first 2 digits, the operator finally confirms the right address, and tell me they'll be on their way. That's when I really start to understand that their arrival will probably cause a confrontation, similar to Paul Pelosi's home intruder attack. My thoughts and heart then race to the moon, thinking of what would happen when they knock. After around 5 to 10 minutes of staring at the stranger, I finally hear them knocking at the back door. Thank God, I thought. I then wait a bit, seeing if the person would react. No. Still immobile in the darkness. I then raise my head and get up and rush to my bedroom door to close it, which is when I notice the figure vanish. I immediately realized what happened. My poor vision had blurred my TV screen, which was at the end of the bed, to appear as a shadowy figure right into the cracked door's gap. I was absolutely sure I saw it move, and also quickly seen what was a face with glasses taking a quick look at the other room. Combined with the darkness of the room and my panic, it convinced me the TV's blur was someone. I've lived here for more than 4 years now, and never had this happen to me. It was simply a coincidence of critical stupidity, poor lighting, having my head's position and poor vision blurring my TV into the exact same width as the door's opening. I didn't want to put on my glasses as they were out of reach from where I was. I then quickly put my underwear on and ran to respond to the police officers, who thought they were responding to a home intruder case. I profusely apologized over and over again, stating that I felt like the stupidest person on earth. They came over to my room and I explained and showed to them what had happened. Realizing nobody was in danger apart from me and my immense stupidity, they took my information and left after having scanned the apartment for any signs of actual danger. They laughed about it once they realized what had actually happened, and most definitely laughed about me too. I know I would have. The only additional proof that I have is my phone's call log, showing the 3 calls that I made. In conclusion, I feel like the stupidest person on earth, and I'm deeply ashamed of having wasted 4 officers' time. But at least there's a tiny bit of positivity. It'll make for a funny story. I now realize binge reading this subreddit probably helped me in creating this imaginary encounter. When I was in high school, I took a glassblowing course at a remote craft school called Snow Farm, located on the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains. It was a 2-week course, and our instructor was this guy in his early to mid-40s who was super badass and ripped, but also very friendly looking. He wore glasses and a tank top to class every day, which revealed these thick scars on the back of his neck and shoulder, as well as a fully tattooed back. The most interesting thing about his appearance, however, was this supervillain-esque scar running from the top of his forehead, down across his right eye, and ending at the bottom of his cheek. As the class got more friendly with him, a few fellow classmates and I asked him what his back piece looked like. He took off his shirt and revealed a vibrantly colorful tattoo of a dragon holding a box cutter. When we asked about the significance about the box cutter, he told us an incredible story that I honestly wouldn't have believed, had he not had the scars to prove it. He began by telling us that he was an amateur boxer for many years and was quite familiar with fighting. One day, he was approached by a crackhead that started screaming at him and trying to fight. The crackhead was apparently trying to rob him. Our instructor at the time punched the crackhead and knocked him unconscious. He explained to us, though, that when someone is under the influence of crack cocaine, meth, or other intense stimulants, they develop almost superhuman abilities. I've heard stories like this that corroborate this. After knocking him out, he got right back up and kept at it. He knocked him out a 3rd time. This time, the crackhead pulled out a box cutter and started slashing at our instructor's face, arms, and back. I'm not sure if the crackhead first attacked him from behind, maybe as he was walking away, because the scars on his back of his neck made it seem like he was sliced by surprise. He knocked the crackhead out again, this time grabbing the box cutter and stabbing the crackhead over and over in the chest with it. He took off his shirt and tied it around his head to prevent the bleeding. He told us that every time his heart would beat, blood would squirt from his head. He then hopped on his bike and rode 20 minutes to the nearest hospital. This story truly sounds out of a movie, but our instructor later explained to me privately that he too was smoking and selling crack at the time. The fight was the result of a crackhead trying to steal his crack. I asked him if he thinks he killed the crackhead, and he said he had no idea because he left immediately after. I got to thinking about how deep of a blade one would need to pierce internal organs. Not really sure, but regardless, I thought it was the most valid story behind a tattoo that I had ever seen. He's been clean for years and has a wife and kids. Him and his wife are quite successful in the glassblowing/metalworking industry. Apologies if this is long. I just can't stop thinking about how I feel at work since all these things have happened, and I don't know if I'm being too harsh or not, as I've not experienced something like this before in my life. My new manager starts at my work. He seemed pleasant and nice enough. Quite funny, and I get on well with him. Then I started to see 2 different sides to him. I noticed he was quite flirty in a jokey way with my other colleagues, but I just thought that was his sense of humor. A bit strange, but nothing that I was concerned with. Then, as time went on, I noticed he began to get closer to me and started to touch my shoulders or arms for a few seconds while talking to me and showing me things around work. I work in a retail store. The first few times I thought nothing of it, as it wasn't noticeable enough for me to be uncomfortable. But I began to notice that it was every time he was speaking to me, and there's just no need to touch my arms for a few seconds whilst talking about the work. It invaded my personal space, but at the time I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't know him well and didn't want to make it awkward. But the thing that made it weird to myself was that he would always make it apparent and obvious if he touched me. He would always apologize and say things like, "Oh, sorry, I know some people don't like it," and "oh sorry, I guess I'm getting close there," and just announces the fact that he touches me and gets close to me. At this point, I'm just questioning why he even mentions it and brings it to the surface. If you didn't think it was a problem, then why even speak of it? At this point, I thought it was odd, but there was nothing he did that was ever over the top, if you will. He had not made any sexual comments or touched any parts of my body that was my space only. And we had worked alone plenty of times, and he didn't do anything out of the ordinary. Just some weird comments about being sorry for touching me. Then my boyfriend told me to watch it, because every time I work with him, there's something else that happens where I think, oh no, not again. The more I've worked with him, each time something else happens, and it's become a noticeable pattern. Then this happened. Me and my manager were looking over at the work board, talking about the orders for the rest of the week. I said the wrong date accidentally for an order, and he looks at me and pauses, laughs, and then wraps his hands around my neck facing me for a few seconds and says, "Oh, you, my name. What are you like?" Then removes his hands from my neck. I laugh it off really awkwardly as I was taken aback that he touched my neck. It was quite a shock, so I didn't really process this happening, but I've not had anyone touch me like that in my life. This was the first red flag for me, but I still didn't think much of it, as I just thought of it as a one-off. Then, a few weeks later, we were discussing the rotas upstairs off the shop floor when we were alone. He's showing me the rotas, and the days off that he has given me. He has given me a few days off, and I say, "Thank you, that's very nice of you." Then he looks at me and says, "Can I get a cuddle for that?" and smiles. We're standing side by side each other, so I say hesitantly, "Yeah, sure," because I didn't want it to be awkward. After I give him a side hug, he shakes his head for a few seconds, laughs, and says, "Oh, not a cuddle, I mean a hug. You know what I meant." And I just continue to laugh awkwardly as if I just didn't know what to say. Thirdly, we were discussing work on a different day and looking into the storage box. I again said something wrong about where something was placed. And he pauses to look at me and laugh and says, "Oh, my name. You deserve a slap on the bottom for that." And I really awkwardly laugh. He looks at me to wait for what I have to say in response, but I don't say anything as I feel too awkward to say please stop or anything else. I really don't know what to think. That's all he has done to me personally, and the touching my shoulder or arm casually is what he has done multiple times. I've discussed it with my other colleague, and she has had the same experience, only with the touching. We both think it's weird. I've also started to notice the comments he makes with customers, and he is quite forward and creepy with them. For example, we have some free chocolates on display for customers to have, and these were heart-shaped cookies. And my manager is serving someone and says to her, "Oh, help yourself to a chocolate if you like. I promise I'm not hitting on you, haha." And I heard that and thought, this is such a creepy comment to make, and I know if I was a customer, I would not like to be spoken to like that. And then, with there being two sides to every story, he is also very hot/cold, and he has been quite rude to me before during work, to the point where I had to go upstairs and take 5 minutes to myself to collect my emotions and not say something that I regret. I won't go into that as it's not particularly relevant, but sometimes he is kind, but other times he can be very short-tempered and rude to myself and customers. I'm trying not to overthink this, but lately it's all that I'm thinking about, as I don't know where the line is or what to say to him. Everyone tells me to report him and say something, but I'm really stuck on what to do. I have officially confirmed that I do feel creeped out, but his behaviors, and I can't ignore how I feel anymore. Any advice? Or is this even an issue? Edit. I forgot to add, the thing that made me write this post was when we were closing together recently. He started to talk about a young girl and said she's similar to you, who came in to inquire about the job posting. He made a comment saying she was lovely, but then he started to talk about what she was wearing and says, she was wearing these jeans that had multiple rips in them, all the way from her feet to her thighs. Oh no, not that I was looking at her legs, I mean, but and he stumbled while saying that. That to me was very, very odd, and I was uncomfortable with that comment. I've started to write all the incidents down. Thank you everyone for responding. It's made me feel 100% validated in my thoughts about this situation. Update. I told my area manager this morning. He was incredibly supportive and listened to every word I said. He actually said the dates don't entirely matter. The fact it even happened, he said, is enough to go grounds on. He is going to give me a call on Monday to discuss further, away from work. And he said he will tell his hierarchy at HR, and then we will go from there. I was petrified to say anything, but he reassured me that he was glad that I told him, and all of this was inappropriate. He also said I shouldn't have to come to work feeling the way I do. And he said as my manager, he should have known this wasn't correct, and it's nothing that I should be blamed for. I feel so much better after telling him. I'm just now thinking of the confrontation afterwards, and all that which gives me anxiety. But I'm so glad I told someone. Thank you again, everyone, for being so supportive. Hi, my name is Nikki, but most people call me Nick. My house burnt down July 11th, so now we are at my grandparents'. And now it's like December, and this happened like a month ago, but I need to tell someone. I'm a 13-year-old female, and I was walking home from school around 2:40 p.m. Tuesday, November 14th, also known as World Diabetes Day. But then this van with this very old man started slowly following me as soon as I stopped walking with my boyfriend, who was a 14-year-old male. So I walked to a store and got a Monster, and then walked home. Skip to when I get home, flop on my bed. It has a window that leads to the front of the house, and I normally leave the curtains open. This will be important later. I get on a call with my boyfriend and look out the window because I feel like someone is watching me, but only a van is there. 2 to 3 hours later now, my boyfriend is over at my house, and we're just laying on my bed watching a movie. And I look in the window, and the same man that I saw in the van that was following me was staring at me. Then my boyfriend saw me not looking at the movie, and looked over and noticed the man staring at me, and he stuck his middle finger up at him and he drove away. I've seen him 2 other times that I can remember, but after that my boyfriend has been walking to and from school with me. And most of the time he stays the night, because my dad is on a work trip till July 2nd, and my mom gets home at 11:30 p.m., and my grandparents have a different house that they stay at. This is one that they rent out. That is one of my many creepy stories that I have. Let me know if you want to hear more. Bye. Update. I saw him again. He doesn't have a license plate, and he looks like he is 80 years old, and he looks like one of my teachers. If you go to OVEC and know about the grade 7 French teacher, he looks like him, but with a long beard. My story begins when I was 23. I was traveling to my friend's house for the weekend by coach. We lived in different cities in the UK, which were a fair distance between each other. To give you an idea of the journey, I had to take an early morning coach from a stop near to where I lived into my city center. Then it headed to her city, about 3 hours or so, where I had a layover while I waited for a second coach to where my friend lived, to get there about lunchtime. When we got into my city, a lot of people got on, and an older guy sat next to me in the aisle seat. We set off, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw/heard him looking at me and saying I was beautiful. I pretended not to hear, but he tapped me on the shoulders, so I took out my headphones. He repeated that I was very beautiful and asked for my name, if I was single and where I was headed to, which I stupidly told him out of politeness and instantly regretted. He told me his name, and some stuff about himself. Let's call him Pete, because I can't remember his actual name. A few minutes into the conversation, he started to repeatedly grab my hand while telling me again that I am beautiful, and that he wants me to be his girlfriend. I kept on pulling my hand out of his while telling him no. I weirdly noticed during this that his left pinky finger was half missing. During this, there was a different guy on the seat opposite watching us, and I looked at him pleadingly to help me, but he just looked away. Pete then moved on to asking for my number multiple times, to which I kept on saying no again, and that I don't give it out to strangers. He says that we're not strangers, we're friends. Pete then said something with a super creepy smile that stuck with me. I will call you again, and again and again. In the day and in the night, I will call you all the time. To try and get out of the situation, I said that I would take his number and call him later when I got off the coach. It took a while of persuading, but in the end, he gave it to me, along with his name, while he watched me add him to my contacts. He wanted me to ring him right then and there, but I refused. For the last hour and a half of the journey, he finally left me alone. Thank goodness. We finally reached the destination city, and guess who was waiting for me when I got off? Yes, it was Pete. I walked quickly away, and he followed me asking me where I was going. I ignored him and went into the ladies' toilets to hide there for about 15 to 20 minutes, hoping that he'd leave. I started shaking and didn't feel safe, so I sat in the cubicle and locked the door, and also deleted his number. When I came back out, there Pete was, waiting again. I started walking around the coach station in a circle to lose him, but he kept up, asking me where I was going, and insisting he came with me. At this point, I had had enough, so spoke to him quite rudely, telling him that I had to get another coach soon to my friends, and he can't come with me. Just in case he tried anything else, I stayed in a crowded area, put my music back on and ignored him. He hung around watching me for a bit, but when I looked back up after a while, he had thankfully gone. I was still nervous, looking around should he show up again. On the second coach, I checked all of the people that got on just in case by chance he had remembered where I was going and bought himself a ticket. But luckily he didn't. The next day on my way back, I was vigilant as well. Last night I was walking home from my girlfriend's house. I passed some traffic lights, and to the right on the pavement I was walking on, I saw a woman just completely stopped. I assumed she was someone who wasn't local, about to ask for directions, so I took my headphones out, slowed down a bit and smiled. It was dim, so I don't attribute this to anything weird, but it's what made me not stop. I couldn't make out any features at first. I was maybe 2 or 3 meters away from her. Bear in mind, she had been in my view for about 20 seconds and hadn't moved at all, so I was already a bit freaked out. I'm naturally a cautious person, so I was getting ready to go through some harrowing experience. I got a bit closer and still couldn't make out her facial features, but it seemed like her face was distorted. Again, it wasn't, but it's what creeped me out, so I thought I'd mention it. When I got closer, I could see that her face was perfectly normal. This is where I assumed she wasn't local and about to ask for directions, but her face was emotionless. It had been over a minute of me being aware of her, where she still hadn't moved. I didn't stop because I felt creeped out. I just brushed it off, but I did do a check about a minute later and she still hadn't moved. I kept looking, and eventually she turned to her right, maybe fully around, I couldn't tell. It ran through my mind for the next few minutes, so I called my girlfriend because I'd be more comfortable that way. I got home fine, and I just assumed it must have been that illness where some parts of your body freeze. I can't remember what it's called, but I did hear about it once. Last night I slept fine and didn't think much of it, but I did think about it for a while. I just got back from a driving lesson as I'm writing this, and at that lesson, I heard what made me think this was worth writing. I told my instructor of this eerie experience I had the night before. He lives in the area where I saw it, but early in the morning today he saw a woman, blonde hair and expressionless, as he said. But she was wearing a face mask at that point for some reason. Likely could be a different person. She was hunched down, sat against a wall like a 1 to 2 minute walk max from where I saw her. He said she was breathing very heavily and it creeped him out. Massive coincidence that we both saw it if it was the same person, but creepy either way. I'm not sure if I'm glad I didn't say something, because something could have been going on and I could have been hurt, or just completely scared to walk home late anymore. Or if I should have asked if she needed help, because I now want to know what was going on. Either way, I'll never figure it out, and that could be a good thing. I was about 12 years old in the early 2000s. My family was going on a trip overnight with my dad for work, and they were letting me stay home alone. My grandparents lived in an attached apartment, so I wasn't truly alone. Nonetheless, I was quite excited to stay up all night, eat pizza and candy, and play video games till the morning. The night before my parents were scheduled to leave, I had woke up at 3 a.m. This wasn't unusual as I would have trouble sleeping. Half asleep, I stumbled down the stairs to the living room on my way to the kitchen for a little midnight snack. I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the moonlight spilled in through the window, lighting up the room enough to see my steps, but not enough to see clearly. I looked up from my feet to see ahead of me, and on the couch was something that left me terrified. A man, dressed in an all-black suit, with a hat similar to a cowboy hat, was sitting straight up on the couch, legs crossed and hands together as if he were waiting for someone. As I stated, he raised his head up to look at me. A pair of red eyes pierced my soul, and an evil grin flicked across the face. I immediately felt an ice-cold chill as my hair stood on end. I turned around and bolted back upstairs and straight into my room. After a minute, I tried to be brave and come back down, this time turning the light on from the top of the stairs. The man was nowhere to be seen, and nothing was out of place. I had seen the red eyes in the house before, peering at me from the closet of my sick mother's room. I think it was a demon who preyed on her, which is a story for another time. But this encounter was the first time I ever saw the attached to the body. And even now, nearly 20 years later, it still puts me on edge as I can remember the experience in detail. There's more stories from the haunted house where I grew up, which I may share another time if there's interest. Has anyone else seen this top hat shadow man too? What are your thoughts? Thanks for reading my true scary story. When I was in college, my girlfriend at the time lived in an apartment off campus. The back door was in a closet-sized back room, which she kept a hide-a-key in for when I came over. It sat on a very dusty wooden support beam nailed to the wall. One night I came home and went to grab the key, when it slipped out of my fingers, and I watched it fall into the very small dusty space between the wall and the support beam. Frustrated, I knocked on the door, woke my girlfriend, and retrieved a knife to fish out the key tucked behind the support beam. When I went to stick the knife in, there wasn't a space between the wall and the support beam. It was totally snug. I was confused. I was 100% sure that I just saw the key fall. I wiped away the dust, pulled on the beam, nothing. Completely solid and immovable. I remember stopping and thinking for a few minutes, completely dumbfounded and trying to process what I just experienced. Cut to me and my incredibly superstitious girlfriend searching for the key in the closet-sized back room. The key was gone. We searched for 45 minutes, despite the back room being practically empty apart from some unused shelves. She wouldn't let me stop looking. It was her only key, and she was very scared. As I mentioned, she was very superstitious and was convinced the apartment was haunted. The next day, we got a replacement key and sort of forgot about the whole ordeal. Months later, we randomly found the missing key sitting carefully in the back room on the same beam I saw it fall through. From observation, it appeared to be sitting in the exact same spot it disappeared from, and seemingly even in the same position. I have zero explanation, and no valid guesses as to what I witnessed. I wonder if things disappear all the time, but most of them are just rocks and leaves and things you'd never notice. My girlfriend at the time was convinced it was a ghost. I think I'm more on the side of a glitch. Everything began when I was 4. The house that I lived in, my aunt's house, wasn't by any means haunted. It was more like I was the one who was haunted. It was around 7 p.m. and everyone was in the kitchen, and all the lights had been turned off except, of course, the kitchen light. I grew bored, so I decided to go play with my toy cars out in the living room, but I didn't turn on any lights because there was enough light emanating from the kitchen. I suddenly feel like someone is staring at me, but I just ignore it and continue playing. A couple of minutes later, I needed to use the bathroom, and to do so, I had to walk through a hallway, which seemed to be darker than usual. I was about to turn on the light when a decrepit-looking hand shoots out from the hallway frame, holds up its index finger, and wagged it, as in saying no. At that moment, I didn't feel scared, so I get a bit closer and turn on the light. When I do, I see a demon-like face. I lock eyes with it, and it slowly puts its finger to its mouth in a shushing motion. It was only then, when a wave of panic hit me and I ran towards to the kitchen screaming. But when my aunt went to check along with my cousins, they said they saw nothing. From that point forward, paranormal things happen to me no matter where I am. I don't know who this demon is or where it came from. I don't know why it has attached itself to me. I've been told that it might have gotten attached because of all the negativity that I have experienced at such a young age. No one may believe this story, but if you do, please send your thoughts and opinions on what I should do. This is a story from years ago, so I don't remember the exact details. Anyways, I was about 10 or 11 when this happened, and my brother was around 15 or 16. And this was around the time the Nintendo Switch game console came out, so I was pretty much begging my mom to get it so I could play it. Keep this in the back of your head. Anyway, I was playing outside with my brother, and we then noticed some guy. He was around 5'8" or 5'11". He was a college student, and he started talking to us. And my mom must have seen this going on, so she stepped outside to see what was up. The guy was asking about some donation charity thing again. This was a while ago, so I don't exactly remember the details. And the guy was talking for about 10 minutes, and I didn't really absorb it since I was a kid. But what caught my ears was when the guy said something about us wanting to go to GameStop. I didn't really realize how serious this was because 1, I was a kid, and 2, I just thought me and my older brother were talking about it. But my mom kind of rushes us in and says she might call his number and talk to him about it when I'm pretty sure she just used us as an excuse to come inside. A few minutes later, my mom and grandmother were on the phone with the police. Me as a kid was wondering what was happening, because he just seemed like a nice guy that wanted us to help him out. I don't really remember anything past the police, and my mom talking, and me being asked to go in my grandma's room to watch TV. As I got older, I realized how serious and disturbing this was, as the guy was stalking us, and now I remember that we didn't even talk about the console outside. Kinda crazy to think that we were stalked and listened to by a college student. That now I think about his charity thing and it was probably a scam. Moral of the story, just be careful around strangers and keep your information private. As I begin writing this, I'm surprised to recall how many near-death experiences I've had, from a horrific car accident to being nearly trampled by a moose. God has kept himself busy by sparing my life up to this point, but today's story revolves around an event that nearly killed myself and 6 other family members. I live in southeastern Idaho. It's a beautiful and scenic part of the West. The mountains tower so high that I can see both Montana and Wyoming from my house. An hour north of my home is a region called Island Park, and is hands down one of my favorite places to vacation. The area is nestled inside an enormous volcanic caldera, which was born out of the same hotspot that created nearby Yellowstone National Park. The rugged countryside is blanketed by tall, lodgepole pine trees, and is home to some of the best fishing this side of the Mississippi. Some of my best memories have been made there. Youth conferences, musical retreats, cabin trips, boating, hiking, you name it. I'm currently married and a father of 4. I love my family and enjoy nothing more than going out of the house for a little adventure with them. Come summer of 2020, we had just recently purchased our first family-sized tent and were anxious to get out and camp. To make things even more fun, we invited my wife's parents, along with her sister and her husband, to join us for a weekend up in Island Park. My father-in-law, Kurt, had access to his dad's boat, which made us all the more excited to go. One of the main attractions at Island Park is the reservoir. Nestled at the foot of Swatel Peak, the large reservoir is lined by collections of cabins, docks, boat ramps, and a private resort. It's practically paradise. During our trip, we planned to spend Friday camping, then head out on the water on Saturday for a day of water skiing and tubing. Before leaving, I had checked the weather in case we needed to expect any rain. The forecast had predicted a chance of rain on Saturday, but given that it was only a 50% chance, I figured it wouldn't be much of a hindrance to our recreation. When we arrived at the boat ramp that Saturday, it was picturesque. The sun was beaming down on us, and the only clouds you could see were miles away. As far as I was concerned, we'd gotten lucky, and were spared the annoyance of a storm breaking up the day. Given that this was 2020, everyone and their dog had descended onto every outdoor venue between here and Jackson Hole. Months of pandemic restrictions had pushed people to spend more time outdoors, where the restrictions simply didn't exist. The dirt parking lot was absolutely full, with a line of trucks slowly delivering boats onto the large boat ramp that dipped into the south shore of the lake. After some waiting, we finally got our turn to put in. I helped back up the trailer into the water while Kurt directed the boat out towards the dock adjacent to the ramp. The boat itself wasn't huge. I'm no expert, but it's what you might actually expect for that kind of occasion. The bow had a horseshoe-shaped bench sheet that ran all along the front. Spanning the center was a windshield, with a hinged center pane that could open so passengers could move along the aisle to the back of the boat. Next sat a row of bucket seats for the driver and a passenger, with another 2 rows of seats facing each other in the stern. As we began loading the boat, it began showing signs of engine trouble. At one point, it completely died, which is ironic considering my wife's grandpa had just gotten it tuned up at a local shop. Kurt, myself, and my brother-in-law Josh set about inspecting the engine to determine the problem. Best we could tell, it was the battery, which then required us to detach the trailer, pull the SUV back onto the ramp, and jumpstart the boat. Luckily, it started back up, but this meant we couldn't turn off the boat and risk it dying out in the middle of the lake. I saw all this as a mere inconvenience when I should have considered it an omen. At last, we set sail with all 10 of us aboard, including our 4 kids who were all under the age of 7. After buzzing around for a while, our 2 youngest kids began asking when we could eat. Given our delayed start, it was already lunchtime. Not wanting to cut the fun short, we decided my mother-in-law would take the younger kids back to camp, while we stayed out on the water. While heading back to the dock, we all began to notice a distant mass of dark clouds forming to the west. Once we had dropped the other 3 off, we debated about whether we should risk going back out if a storm was approaching. In situations like this, I tend to be the one who says, "It'll be fine." We put a lot of time and effort into getting there, and considering that I make it onto a boat maybe once a year, I wasn't about to simply cancel it all because it might get rainy. My wife tends to be much more of a worrier, and was encouraging us to just stay and maybe come back later. Somehow, we all agreed to go back out and just keep an eye on the storm. Any signs of lightning, then that would be our signal to get out. As we set out again, we headed towards the northeastern end of the lake. Here it begins to narrow and wind into the trees like a snake, to the point where it almost looks like a wide river. There were far less boats here and looked to be a safe place to start water skiing. Josh went first, only crashing a couple of times and managing to stay up for a good while. I volunteered to go next. By this time, the sky had morphed into gray, and from our view northward, we could see dark clouds beginning to envelop Swatel Peak. You know those storms where the sun still manages to shine through open pockets in the clouds? It was like that. This beautiful contrast of billowing white and gray clouds with misty curtains of rain reaching towards the ground, while bright golden rays of sunshine permeate through like arrows, shooting towards the ground. It was a stunning scene, and a facade that masked the danger that laid ahead of us. Given the scene, my wife asked that I consider staying in the boat and that we start heading back. Being my stubborn, adrenaline-starved self, I pleaded that we go a little longer. We decided 10 minutes tops. I slid into the water, which was very cold considering we were up in the mountains, and it was like fresh ice melt. I'm lousy at water skiing since I've never done it enough to get good at it. After my second failed attempt at getting out of the water, we saw our first strike of lightning. It was a mile or two north on Swatel, but it was close enough to light a fire under my butt. Time to go. As quickly as I could, I swam back to the boat, and once in, we hightailed it back in the direction we had come. Almost on cue, we began feeling the pitter-patter of raindrops as an eastern wind began to pick up. Thunder rumbled from behind us, and given how narrow the lake was at that point, a wall of tall pines obstructed our view to the west. It wasn't until we rounded a bend that opened up to the open lake that we got a full view of what laid ahead. In the moment we had before an angry wall of rain fully hit us, I felt a rush of both awe and terror. The once pristine and calm blue water had transformed into a rolling mass of white crests, and the sky was nothing more than a curtain of rain under a ceiling of furious black clouds. When people think of dangerous storms on the water, most picture the ocean, but storms over large lakes can cause massive swells too. I couldn't believe how quickly everything had changed. It couldn't have been more than 45 minutes since we had last been at that spot, and the storm had appeared to be far away at that time. It felt like it had snuck up on us, like a hungry beast stealthily trapping its prey. Within seconds, we were hit with a barrage of rain. The droplets were so large, they felt like small pebbles peppering our skin. Aside from light jackets, we were only wearing swimsuits, so there was little in the way of protection from the elements. From where I was sitting on the back seat, I had a full view of everyone in the boat. To my left was Josh, trying helplessly to shield his face from the rain. In the middle of the boat, between the forward-facing driver and passenger seats, sat my wife, her sister, and my 2 kids. One held towels over the kids, while the other was hurriedly looking around for any other form of protection. She managed to find 2 square flotation pads, which they had held over their heads like umbrellas. Kurt was at the wheel, crouching down low enough to keep his eyes under the protection of the windshield. I don't know exactly how fast we were going, or the speed of the opposing winds blowing against us, but it felt like I had stuck my head out the car window on a highway. I was finding it hard to breathe, both from the wind and the ice-cold rain that was relentlessly drenching my barely covered body. For the first 30 seconds or so, Josh and I exchanged surprised looks and exclamations like, "This is insane," and "Holy crap, dude." We knew the situation was shocking, but it didn't feel like life-threatening yet. It wasn't until the waves hit us that the real fear began to set in. The boat began to bounce in short successive bursts, until suddenly we felt the bow dip down and swiftly pitch back upward again. These weren't small waves like you encounter in the wake of another boat. These were big, far bigger than any I'd experienced firsthand on a lake. Each time the bow dipped and plunged into a crest, water would wash over the front rails and into the boat. It wasn't enough to fill the boat, but my fear at that moment was the possibility of being capsized, especially if the battery happened to die on us again. Despite the fact we all wore life jackets, it is possible that a capsize could trap someone underneath, injure them, or simply leave us at the mercy of the raging water. As a confident swimmer, I was less worried about myself, and all the more worried about my wife and kids. Should they find themselves out of the boat, it's entirely possible they could still drown by being tossed and pushed under the surface. With squinted eyes, I tried to survey the surrounding waters. Through the sheets of rain, I could make out at least a dozen other boats, all converging on the boat ramp that still lay at least several hundred yards ahead of us. They all must have been equally as surprised by the storm as we were, because I could also see that the boat ramp was jammed full of trucks and trailers, frantically trying to get their boats out of the water. With this being our only way out, this meant everyone else was stuck on the lake until the space opened up on the ramp. My skin burned with the force of everything hitting it. Kurt was white-knuckling the boat against the storm, his shoulders hunched and head down like a linebacker. We seemed to be keeping the boat under as much control as he could manage, making sure to hit waves head-on so as to avoid flipping. My poor kids were terrified. Despite the shelter the women provided, they were soaked and freezing in the midst of a violent storm that had all of us screaming at each other just to be heard. I could see the dread in everyone's eyes, that expression of disbelief and fear being plunged into a potentially deadly situation. As we approached the ramp, it was clear that our only option was to disembark, and it would be to try and position the boat against the dock. However, this dock was not built into the ground on pylons. This was a floating dock, made to lay on top of the water as level rose and fell during the year. It was anchored to a single post high on the shore, which meant that in these conditions, it was a moving target. Kurt positioned the boat about 50 yards to the windward side of the dock, intending to essentially let the wind and water push us against the dock and hopefully provide enough stability to let us get out. That point in the journey was by far the most terrifying. In this position, we were now parallel with the waves, meaning we were now vulnerable to being capsized if we didn't reach the dock in time. In perhaps a vain effort to maintain stability, us men positioned ourselves on the right side of the boat, hoping our weight could keep that side of the boat from rising too steep. Slowly we drifted over, anticipating that once we were close enough, we would have to try and get everyone off without someone getting crushed between the boat and the dock. The closer we got, the clearer I could see my fellow boaters frantically mounting boats onto their trailers, then signaling for drivers to go before they'd even have time to get off the boats themselves, all in an effort to get as many people off the water as possible. Fortunately, we came within reach of the dock without tipping. Kurt maintained controls while Josh and I grabbed hold of the dock, trying to stabilize the boat as it bounced against the side. Once I got off, I immediately reached back to get the kids out. They were sobbing and struggled to move while my wife handed them up to me. That was the first moment I felt some level of relief, knowing that at the very least they were out of the water. Josh helped lead them up to the dock, while my wife and her sister disembarked, leaving Kurt at the wheel. Over the roar of the storm, Kurt shouted for me to try and keep the boat from floating away, while he went to fetch the trailer. Though, he would have to leave the engine idling in order to avoid another possible battery failure. Seconds later, Josh returned. He and I grabbed onto the metal boarding brackets while Kurt disembarked and sprinted up to the parking lot. Given the roughness of the water, neither of us could try and find rope or fenders to cushion the boat banging against the dock. So there we stayed, kneeling down and doing our best to keep the boat from either drifting away or crashing against us too hard. Since it was still idling, it slowly began pushing itself towards the shore, until eventually it nudged up against the concrete ramp underneath us. With each series of waves, we could feel the hull scraping against it, but there was nothing more we could do other than pray that the damage wouldn't become too drastic. Sitting there trying to patiently wait for the trailer was agonizing. It felt like sitting under a freezing cold shower. The rain continued to bear down on our bare skin like rocks, the wind blowing so hard it was almost coming down sideways. My entire body was shivering so hard it felt like a seizure. It was difficult to speak coherently, let alone grip the heavy boat and keep it somewhat anchored. Strangely enough, the only slight bit of physical comfort at that moment was the lake water as it splashed up onto the dock. Remember how I said the lake water was fresh ice melt? Well, compared to the rain and wind, it felt surprisingly warm. So every couple seconds, a wave would splash us and give a very brief sensation of warmth. We knew Kurt could move only so fast. The ramp was still packed with trucks and trailers, while boats were struggling to position themselves properly and avoid hitting each other. So we waited and held on. Looking out across the lake, I wondered at how we had made it back safely. It literally looked like rough seas. Having lived in this region most of my life, storms like this were extremely rare. And while weather in the mountains can change quickly and drastically, I had never seen something this extreme. It felt and looked like a monsoon or a hurricane. I don't know how long it took, but at long last, we could see Kurt's trailer making its way down to the ramp. Once he was in position, he had to climb back into the boat and maneuver it around the dock. From what I could tell, we were some of the last ones to get out. We did our best to guide the boat onto the trailer, standing in the now warm-feeling water until it felt secure. I jumped on the SUV and drove us up the ramp and onto the now muddy parking lot. After gathering a few personal items from the boat, I was finally able to climb into the second row seats where my wife was waiting for me with a towel. It was finally over. I don't know if it was purely just due to the cold, but I was convulsing. My muscles felt tight and strained. and while they had the heat dialed all the way up, it was like the cold had penetrated all the way into my body and didn't want to let go. My wife kept asking if I was okay and what was wrong. I must have had a stunned look on my face because the worry in her expression said it all. As we drove back towards camp, I finally began to thaw and regain control of my hands. We all chattered in disbelief at what we had just experienced. One minute we were having a good old time. The next, we were on the brink of drowning. It had all happened so fast. It wasn't until we reached camp that the storm began to subside. The shock seemed to wear off relatively quick as we began cooking dinner and carried on with the remainder of our trip. I think we were all just relieved that everyone came away from this experience relatively unharmed, at least physically. It's been 3 years now, and my wife and daughter are still nervous about getting onto boats. I did feel a measure of guilt for having not been more cautious and just playing it safe. I wasn't the only one who had wanted to continue boating that day, but I certainly was stubborn about it. And that desire for fun put us all into a dangerous situation, especially for my kids. While I still love adventure and taking reasonable risks, this nightmare really reined me in. Whenever I'm out with my family, even for something harmless like a hike, I'm always on high alert, with my eyes on my surroundings. Nature is something to fear and respect, feeling the raw power of a relentless storm that couldn't care less about you. That's a deeply humbling experience. Thank you, God, for sparing me once again. When I was about 8 or 9, me and my young sibling went to our babysitter's home for the night, as my mom had to work a late shift. There was me and my sibling, the babysitter, her 3 young grandchildren, and a few dogs in the home. After we had gone to bed, I remember the babysitter running in shouting fire. We were in a 3-story set of flats on the top floor, and the front door was the only safe exit. But that was where the fire had started. We all managed to get out onto the balcony and managed to get the 2 of the dogs out, but the other had run and hid under the bed and was the only casualty. I remember the firefighters using huge ladders and getting us all down safely. Thankfully, after some oxygen, we were all cleared. Years later, my mom told me that the daughter of the babysitter and the mother of the 3 children had had an argument with a woman, and during the night, she poured petrol through the letterbox, trailed it down 2 sets of stairs, and across the landings. Then when she got to the bottom, she set it all alight. I've always wondered if I should have died that night. One thing I've always wanted to know was I nearly murdered? This story had happened to my mother a few weeks ago when she was at the store. It still shakes her up to this day whenever she retells it or thinks about it. One day, my mom had to run down to our local appliance store to look for some extra tools that we needed, as we were renovating the kitchen at the time. So my mom heads over to the appliance store to see if she can find what she needed. After getting out of the car and almost at the front entrance, she notices in her peripheral vision that someone was following her close by. She didn't really think much of it at first, and thought it was another person in a hurry to get in and out of the store like her. My mom continues walking through the store and still can see that there's someone standing not far from where she was. She decided to turn around out of curiosity to see who it was, and noticed that it was some scraggly man who looked like he was either in his early or mid-50s. My mom had gotten a good look at the man and could tell right away that the man didn't belong in the store. He had on worn-out clothes that definitely had seen better days, and had this crazed expression on his face. My mom had locked eyes with the creep for a moment or two before deciding to walk away from him quickly. As she was walking away, she could hear him approaching in her direction slowly. At this point, my mom knew that she was being followed and had to do something about it. She proceeded to walk away at a normal pace as to not alert the guy in any way. She walked a few aisles over to see if the guy would follow her, or if it was just some major coincidence. But as it turned out, it was no coincidence. My mom did this a few more times, and whatever area of the store she went to, this guy followed her. She eventually went to find an employee and tell them about her situation. The man sees that she was walking to an employee and quickly walked away. The employee reassured my mom that they would have someone talk to him and she need not worry. My mom felt relieved after this, knowing that the employee would alert other employees of this creep in the store. For the rest of the time she was there, my mom didn't see the guy anywhere in the store. After she finished buying the supplies that she needed, she left the store and headed straight to her car. My mom wasn't even out of the store for more than 10 seconds, and she immediately had a bad feeling. She looks to her right, and lo and behold, it's the same creep from before. My mom knew that she had to get away from this man and fast, so she started to speed walk towards her car. The man then started to follow her close by. My mom had at least another 200 yards to go until she was at the car. She also had a frightening realization on her way to her car. Whenever my mom had sped up, he would speed up too. Whenever she slowed down or stopped, he would slow down or stop as well. This guy was trying his best to match my mom's footsteps so she couldn't hear him sneaking up on her. It was at this time my mom began to pray that this guy would lose interest or that she can escape from him somehow. My mom could see she was less than 50 yards away from her car and began contemplating whether to sprint to her car or start screaming for help. My mom was almost to her car and could literally feel the guy breathing down her neck. What happened next was what my mom could only describe as divine intervention. As my mom was preparing to fend for herself if the man tried grabbing her, a truck had pulled up in the parking lot and was heading towards them. My mom, without hesitation, waved her hands to get the driver's attention. This had completely caught the man following her off guard. The driver of the truck had slowed down, and my mom began walking towards him. My mom turned around for a split second and saw the man quickly walk away. The driver lowered his window and asked her if she was all right. He also told my mom as he was driving towards her, he saw the sketchy-looking man stalking her from about 10 feet away from her. He also explained how my mom was smart and that she did the right thing for waving him down. The guy had also told my mom how lucky she was that he was there. He explained how there was a woman who had been abducted over a month ago in the area, and she is yet to be found. My mom thanked him and had him watch her get into her car and leave safely. This may not seem like much of a scary story to others, but I like to see how these people would feel and react if they were in my mom's shoes. My mom has since then told me that she's never shopping there again unless my dad is with her. The moral of this story is always pay attention to your surroundings, because you never know who's around you, and it may one day very well just save your life. I'm a 20-year-old female, and when I was between 10 and 12 years old, it was the night before Easter, and my mom and dad liked to keep the magic alive with goofy antics, even if they knew that I knew the truth. So when I looked outside my bedroom window when I couldn't sleep and saw a shadow shaped like a large bunny, I wasn't surprised and smiled and tried to go to sleep. When I was almost asleep, I felt what I can only think to describe as large furry paws or mitts grab my sides. I was facing the wall in my room away from my bedroom door and began to violently shake me in what I guess was an attempt to wake me up. But I hugged my teddy bear and pretended to be asleep until it stopped about 3 to 5 minutes later. I never turned over to look around my room. I never heard my door open or close. Never heard anyone say anything. When I asked my parents about it the next day, they denied coming into my room or putting anything in the windows to make a bunny shadow. Even years later, I vividly remember this experience and have asked my dad over and over again, and he still swears to me they never did that. I know it's easy to pass off as a dream, but I remember the feeling of whatever grabbed me and being shaken. I vividly remember this and truly believe it was real and not a dream. I don't know what it was or why, but I'll never forget that it happened. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Sleep well and have a good night.